Hello, everyone. My name is Marie Cruz. I'm Program Chair of the Art Committee. This season, over 30 programs have been scheduled at the 19th Century Charitable Association. It is our vision to be a dynamic cultural center for community learning. Our mission is to strengthen our community through learning, giving, and sharing our landmark building. Today's program is called Ancient Roman Sculpture from Torlonia Collection. From March to June 25th, the Art Institute of Chicago is presenting an exhibition of ancient Roman sculptures from the Torlonia Collection in Rome. Some of these sculptures were excavated on the Torlonian estates, while others were acquired from other Roman families. Our speaker today, Jeff Nigro, currently teaches at the Newberry Library and is a research associate in the arts of the Greek, Rome, and Byzantium, and he's also an adjunct lecturer at the Art Institute, where he is affiliated for over 30 years. Welcome, Jeff.
Thank you very much, Marie, for the very lovely introduction. Thank you all for inviting me to speak. Thank Jana McElroy, who unfortunately can't be here today, for inviting me to speak. And thank you for your hospitality at lunch. And it's wonderful to see some old friends and make some new friends here, and have to thank Becky and John for technical support, which has been invaluable. And it is a great pleasure for me to discuss this exhibition, Myth and Marble, Ancient Roman Sculpture from the Torlonia Collection, which, as Marie mentioned, will be on view at the Art Institute of Chicago from March 15th until June 29th of 2025. So this is in the way of a preview. What I want to talk about are a little history of the collection, because it's a very fascinating story. And to show you, I won't show you images of every single work in the exhibition, because I had to just trim a little bit in order to get in time, but I also want to give you a sense of the breadth and the quality and the richness of this collection. The Torlonia Collection actually includes 622 ancient Roman sculptures. We are getting 58 of these at the Art Institute, 57 marbles and 1 bronze. They're the only bronze sculpture in the Torlonia Collection, which you will see eventually. And so I want to give you a little background on the collection, on the history of the Torlonia family a little bit, and then delve into the exhibition itself and show you many of the works that will be on view. This is the first time these objects will be seen in the United States. And that's very exciting. And this collection, the Torlonia Collection, is kind of legendary. And that's one of the reasons for the title, Myth and Marble. Not only because there will be some Greco-Roman mythology in the objects represented in the exhibition, but also because the Torlonia Collection itself was somewhat mythic for a number of years, because it was off view for a very long time, and recently has been coming out into the light again and being restored and conserved. And where the 23 of the 58 sculptures that you'll be seeing were just conserved just for our installation, and previously before that, the previous works that had been restored had been so over the past couple of years by the Torlonia Foundation. So, to begin with, now, this is a family tree of the Torlonia family. I don't expect you to be able to read all of that from where you are, but I just want to put it up to say something about who are the Torlonia family. The family was originally French. The name was Torlonias. And members of the family started coming to Rome in the 18th century. And by the late 18th century, the Torlonia family had become bankers. They were from quite humble origin, actually, originally, but they became bankers, and eventually they became bankers for the papacy, and also for the Bonaparte family, as Napoleon had relatives living in Rome. And this as you might imagine, made them a very rich family. And they're relatively speaking, they were sort of nouveau, a new family by the end of the 18th century, but that meant that in compensation, of course, they had a lot of intelligence and they had a lot of energy and a lot of drive to enrich their lives and others' lives with a magnificent art collection, particularly of classical antiquities and particularly of ancient Roman sculptures. The most important for our purposes in terms of the collecting, which took place primarily in the 19th century, include Prince Giovanni Torlonia and his son, Don Alessandro, Prince Alessandro Torlonia. There are a lot of Alessandro Torlonias, and a lot of the family is given this name. And the collection was put together, as you heard in Marie's introduction, primarily through two methods. One was acquiring objects that had belonged to other Roman aristocratic families who, thanks to their perilous financial state, were forced to sell off a lot of them. And secondly, the Torlonia family started to acquire property in and around Rome, eventually amounting to thousands of acres, and they were able to excavate on their estates. A number of incredibly important discoveries were made through these excavations and immensely enriched the collection. This was in the days just before the laws started to change in Italy. Beginning in 1909, the Italian government started to pass a series of laws which sort of negated the old system, which was basically finders keepers. I mean, if it was in your backyard, it belonged to you. But that started to change in the early 20th century, so that now things that are dug up are considered to be cultural patrimony, and so you cannot just assume that they're yours. This was the source of contention through much of the 20th century between the Torlonia family and the Italian government, until a recent Torlonia prince, also named Alessandro, who was determined to change the situation and bring the collection out into the open. And he unfortunately passed away a few years ago, but he was able to begin a Torlonia Foundation, the Fondazione Torlonia, and to reach it's a little complicated, but what it amounts to is a deal whereby the Torlonia Foundation and the Italian government sort of have joint custody of the collection. I mentioned Torlonia estates in and around Rome. If you're a frequent habitué of the Art Institute of Chicago, and we certainly hope you are, the name may ring a bell, and it's possible that you have seen this painting by John Singer Sargent in our collection, the Fountain Villa Torlonia Frascati, Italy, which shows one of Sargent's pupils, an American named Jane Emmett de Glenn, and her husband Wilfred de Glenn, at the Villa Torlonia, which had been purchased from another family at Frascati outside Rome. So the family was buying up all of this property and putting this collection together through these two major means of doing it. I mentioned Don Alessandro Torlonia, excuse me, who was the most important. He lived a long time, from 1800 until into the 1880s, and was able not only to really enhance the collection and grow the collection, but also to open a museum of the Torlonia collection, which I'll get to in just a minute. He acquired many, many titles. The papacy, Rome was still the capital of the Papal States in those days, up until 1870, when the Italian state finally completely unified, and Rome became the capital of the New Italy. But the titles and estates and things that the Torlonias were acquiring were increasingly growing. And Prince Alessandro was behind, for example, the draining of Lake Fiumicino, which was a very important way of not only it was a huge and very expensive and time-consuming project, which not only yielded antiquities, but also helped, to a certain extent, drain the marshy areas around Rome, which were constantly being the source of problems like, malaria and things like that. He eventually did found this museum, which I'll get to, the Museo Torlonia. And when I put up images from the collection that will be in the exhibition, you will notice that I'll have a title and a date. The dates are all CE, or Common Era, or as we used to say, AD, unless otherwise noted. And you will also notice that there is an MT number. It'll say MT 552 or something like that. And the MT stands for Museo Torlonia. Every work in the collection has a number. And this I'll mention a little bit more about this as to how this got cataloged, because it has been immensely helpful for our research for this exhibition. And when I say our, I mean I was acting as research associate, which means I did a lot of work, assisting and supporting and looking things up and putting things together, information together for this exhibition. But the exhibition is being co-curated by Lisa Chakmak, who is the chair and curator of the Arts of Greece, Rome, and Byzantium, and Dr. Catherine Raff, who is our curator of ancient Roman art. And they are really the co-curators of this exhibition. But I've been very involved in this project for at least the last 3 years, so I've gotten to know these things very well, but not having seen them before in person. So they're installing the exhibition even as we speak, and I've gotten to see some of these things in person for the first time, and it's been very thrilling. And then you will all be able to see them come the middle of March. Now, I mentioned that, this idea of acquiring collections from other families. There are three major collections that the Torlonia family acquired over the course of the 19th century. One was the Giustiniani collection. Marchese Vincenzo Giustiniani, also had been from a banking family and receiving a title, was a great collector, patron of the arts, and connoisseur in the 17th century. Most notably, he was, probably most famously today, in addition to collecting antiquities, Marchese Vincenzo Giustiniani was a patron of Caravaggio, Michelangelo Merisi da Caravaggio, and including, for example, this Amor Vinci, Omnia Vincit, in other words, Love Conquers All, featuring this very roguish Cupid. And so this, of course, post-Renaissance fascination, eternal fascination with classical antiquity, with its art, with its philosophy, with its mythology, with its poetry, all of these things fed into this kind of antiquarian interest and the fascination with Greco-Roman antiquity. For example, one of the objects from the Giustiniani collection that the Torlonias acquired, and we'll see her again, is this sculpture who is known as the Hestia Giustiniani. And you can see here it says 2nd century CE, and it has possibly from the reign of the Emperor Hadrian, and her MT, Museo Torlonia number, is 490. This Hestia was the Greek goddess of the hearth. She's not a goddess who appears a lot in art, and we're not sure why people think she's Hestia. They originally thought she was a Vestal Virgin, one of these Roman virgin priestesses who guarded the sacred flame in the city of Rome itself. but it's Hestia, Vesta being then the Roman equivalent of Hestia. She eventually, in the 19th century, came to be called Hestia, and she probably originally was holding a staff of some sort, which may be an attribute. But she was part of the Giustiniani collection, as you can see from this catalog that was published in the 17th century from the Galleria Giustiniana, which was this engraved series of images and text describing the Giustiniani collection. And so here she is very clearly, it's the same sculpture. So it's invaluable to have this kind of documentary evidence. The other great collection, major collection, or the second of the three, I should say, that the Torlonias acquired during the 19th century was the Albani collection. It's particularly one collector that I want to call out here, but it's now the Villa Albani Torlonia here. In Rome, which still has antiquities in it as well, and which currently serves as the kind of office or headquarters of the Torlonia Foundation. In the 18th century, the Villa Albani was a great center for the development of what we call neoclassicism, the mid-18th into early 19th century revival of classical antiquity in an even more rigorous way, thanks to, among other things, the excavations of the ancient Roman cities of Pompeii and Herculaneum. And the Villa Albani at that time was presided over by Cardinal Alessandro Albani, who was a papal nephew, which was a typical thing in those days. When your uncle became the pope, you might become a cardinal. But he was a man of great taste and great fascination with, again, with classical antiquity and classical subjects. His kind of secretary at the villa, Johann Joachim Winkelmann, the German scholar, who is the kind of the leading intellectual light, the sort of the person who kind of develops the philosophy behind 18th and early 19th century neoclassicism, and who was just passionately loved ancient sculpture and catalogs it very thoroughly and very thoughtfully. And so the Villa Albani, this is a ceiling by, you have the patron, Cardinal Albani, you have Winkelmann, who is the kind of intellectual behind it, and then visually you had the German artist Anton Raphael Mengs, who began this kind of this sort of crystalline neoclassical style, one of the originators of it, and this ceiling fresco in the Villa Albani showing Parnassus, the mountain in Greek myth, haunted by Apollo, the god of light and poetry and prophecy, and the 9 muses. So this idea of the Villa Albani as a center of arts, as a center of culture, and as a center of classical revival is summed up in this painting. And then there's the third collection that the acquisition of which in the 19th century really helped to immeasurably enrich the Torlonia collection, was the collection of a sculptor named Bartolomeo Cavaceppi, who over the course of the 18th century was able to put together a notable collection of antiquities. And so acquiring all these things together and then turning to the excavations on their own estates, it got to the point of where the Torlonia collection ended up with 622 works of ancient Roman sculpture. As I mentioned, the Prince Alessandro in 1875 opened a museum, a Museo Torlonia in Rome, which you see a photograph here of some visitors admiring some of the sculptures. The I'll get back to this, but these portrait busts, we're going to have a series of imperial portrait busts in the exhibition, and the Torlonias were being what they thought was very methodical in acquiring sort of one of each, making sure you have at least one portrait of every Roman emperor and every Roman empress or other important imperial woman. We couldn't take all of them, but we are focusing on a particular era of the Roman Empire, which I will get to. And then what has been absolutely, really a godsend, not just for the collection, but also for anyone researching the collection, as Lisa, Katie Raff, and I have been doing the last couple of years, was that in the 1880s, in 1884, 1885, a Carlo Ludovico Visconti, he and his uncle were both sort of scholars of classical antiquity. Carlo Ludovico Visconti published a catalog of the Torlonia Collection, which was financed by Prince Alessandro Torlonia, and they took photographs of every single work in the collection. This was incredibly lavish by the standards of the 1880s to have a photograph, and of course they're all black and white, it's the 1880s, and the photography quality isn't always, I mean, it's not exactly digital photography, but we have the visual record of every single one of them, and it is this period when they really acquired all their MT numbers, their Museo Torlonia numbers. It has made it so much easier to research, because if there's a reference to a particular sculpture by its number or with the photograph, you can compare it to the photograph in this publication, and you know that you've got the right one. It's made everything so astonishingly easy. This is not to say that it's been an absolute breeze and a piece of cake to put this exhibition together, because that's not true of any exhibition. You always have your challenges and things that you're looking for, but it has been immeasurably helpful, not only to us, but to others who have researched the collection, particularly Italian scholars. I have to shout out to Salvatore Settis, Carlo Gaspari, and Stefania Tuccinardi, who all in recent years have been living with this collection and documenting it and publishing on it. And so this was one of the previous installations for a Torlonia exhibition in 2021, in which they selected a group of pages from the Visconti publication, or facsimiles thereof, to display. And we are going to have a similar kind of display in our installation of the exhibition, with some copies of the pages from the Visconti catalog. The Visconti catalog is available for download online, so it's there, and as I said, it's been immeasurably helpful. This was particularly helpful because after World War II, the collection went more or less into storage. And this is when what I alluded to earlier, with this kind of dispute between the Italian state and the Torlonia family as to who owned these and who had the rights to them. And so when the late Prince Alessandro Torlonia was able to take this passionate commitment to making sure that people knew about the family collection, and coming up with this arrangement whereby the Italian state is happy, the Torlonia Foundation is happy, and so, there's great relations between them, and that's also been extremely helpful in terms of being able to borrow these works. This is just a view of some of the sculptures when they were in their former storage area. I never had the pleasure of experiencing this, but colleagues have, and they say it's just amazing. It was amazing to walk through these storage areas with all these hundreds of sculptures around, some of which are kind of legendary and people knew through engravings or photographs or discussions from earlier time periods. And to be able to experience these in person and have them freshly cleaned is very, very exciting. So that said, I'm going to now delve into objects that will be in the exhibition, and I'm going to be talking about it not so much in terms of what order you will see them in the show, although to a certain extent that's true. But the order in which they're listed in our exhibition checklist, there will be a publication in connection with the exhibition as well. I guess you could call it a catalog. It has some very enlightening essays in it about the history of the collection, but also about the function that these different objects played in the context of ancient Roman society. And then there will be a complete checklist with conservation information and a beautiful photograph of every single object that will be in the show. So I begin with actually three sort of icons of the Torlonia Collection, which are probably the three most famous sculptures that they have, considered the very finest quality, and the ones that have been, again, people knew of but didn't necessarily see on a regular basis, and to be able to have them on view for the public is very, very exciting. And this is the first of them. This is a portrait of a young woman, and she's gone by different names, now generally referred to as the Maiden of Volci. Volci is in one of these spots near Rome where this sculpture was excavated, thanks to Torlonia excavations. You'll sometimes see her described in the literature as the Torlonia girl, as a matter of fact. And I'm showing you here also the back of her head. This is a sculpture from the mid-1st century BCE, so before the Common Era. And so we're looking at the sort of late Republican period in Rome. And we believe that this was a young woman who died young, and her family would have dedicated this to her as a memorial sculpture. You can see both, again, the front and back, the beauty of the carving, the exquisite handling of the features, and this sort of haunting expression, but also the sort of strange situation with her head and her hair, because a hairstyle would have been carved separately and placed on top of her. This is very typical, and when you have memorial sculptures, and this happened with empresses as well as with private women, it very often is that you didn't want to look out of style. So if hairstyles changed, you wanted that flexibility to be able to add a different hairstyle to you. She would originally have had eyes inlaid with some kind of other material, perhaps glass or bone. And she also has, might see a hole in her earlobe. She would have had real jewelry, earrings placed on her as well. And as I'm sure a lot of you know, these ancient Greek and Roman sculptures were invariably painted, but with time the paints have faded, and there's some sculptures, including a couple in the Torlonia exhibition, in which traces of color are still visible in certain areas. But this was the very common thing to do in antiquity. Now, I'm showing you the back of her head here. The one thing I should say as a kind of disclaimer is that I won't be showing you a whole lot of images in the round. In a couple of instances I will, but because some of these objects will be displayed in our exhibition in ways that you can walk around them and see them from different angles. But just for a number of reasons, a lot of them may be just sort of up against the walls, and that's because of the size of our spaces, our gallery spaces. The exhibition, if you are familiar with the Art Institute, the exhibition is not going to be in Regenstein Hall in the Rice Building, where most of our special exhibitions are. Currently, that Regenstein Hall is housing the Project a Black World exhibition, which is about Pan-Africanism in art, which is a fabulous show, and I highly recommend. Our exhibition is going to be in the modern wing of the Art Institute when you come in at Monroe Street, and there are those first floor galleries where contemporary art is usually, that's where we usually have contemporary exhibitions. It'll be in there, in the Abbott galleries, and in the Buxbaum galleries across the way, which is usually where modern contemporary photography is. And there will be a couple of pieces in our galleries, in the Jaharis galleries of Greek, Roman, and Byzantine art, just a couple of pieces to make comparisons to loan objects that we have as part of our collection. And I'll show you some images of those as well. So it's for practical reasons, but also because the Soprintendenza dei Beni Culturali, which is the sort of the ministry that in Italy that oversees cultural patrimony, and there are concerns about the safety of the sculptures. A lot of these will be against the wall, but there are some you'll be able to see in person, in 3 dimensions. So we go from this lovely young lady to these 2 gentlemen. These are wonderful examples of sort of either late Hellenistic or Roman Republican ways of approaching portraiture, especially for men. There's clear gender differences in these kinds of sculptures where men are portrayed more realistically and women are portrayed more idealistically as a general rule. It's not universal, but it's a general rule. On the left, this figure has been referred to as Euthydemus of Bactria, who was a Hellenistic ruler in what is now Afghanistan, and we're not sure how it acquired that name. This sort of hat that he's wearing is sometimes worn by Hellenistic rulers, although there was a time when he was thought to be a fisherman, so it's really hard to say. But this incredibly vivid realism to the carving. On the right is this man who is called the Old Man of Otricoli, who was excavated at that site by one of these Torlonia excavations in the 19th century. I should say that the head of the figure on the right is ancient, but the bust part is later. It's 19th century, probably. And this is something I want to stress. No work of ancient sculpture has survived today looking exactly as it did when it left the artist's studio. Things have been restored even in antiquity, but this was certainly true in the 16th, 17th, 18th, 19th centuries when people didn't like looking at fragments. They didn't like looking at headless bodies or, bodies, faces with noses missing or, little bits and pieces gone. And so restoration or kind of gluing things together, basically with a little cement or something, was quite common. And this is true of pretty much every sculpture in the Torlonia collection. Often famous sculptors did work like this, kept the pot boiling between commissions by doing restorations of ancient sculptures. Very often what you will see, and I'll point out some examples in the Torlonia exhibition, which you will see everything in it is ancient, but they didn't all originally belong together, and they're being they were pieced together in the 19th century or sometimes earlier in these earlier collections, like the Giustiniani or Albani collections. And so they were sort of reconstituted or turned into a different work of art. This is a case in point. This is the only, well, it's not quite true. I was going to say the only imperial portrait which does not date from the 2nd century in the show, but that's not quite true. But this is a statue of an emperor with a head of Augustus, the first Roman emperor. And so we don't know if the head and the body are both ancient. They both didn't originally belong together, but they were put together. But whoever this body belonged to, it could be Augustus or it could be another emperor, but it is very typical of the way Augustus often liked to be portrayed, as this seated, kind of half-nude, godlike figure. The other thing with Augustus is that in Augustus's portraiture, he never ages. He always looks this same sort of youthful, vigorous face that he has. This is not universally true of imperial portraits. We'll see that Augustus didn't exactly set a precedent for this because other emperors often had themselves portrayed realistically to a certain extent, including the aging process, and we'll see examples of that as well. The other, the main focus of the imperial portraiture that we're using for this exhibition that we've borrowed concentrates on the 2nd century. And here's a family tree, which again, I know you won't be able to read. But this and the Torlonia family tree are going to be big vinyls in the exhibition, so you'll be able to follow all of this. For a number of reasons, the curators decided to concentrate on the 2nd century emperors, and this era of the so-called adoptive emperors, where a lot of emperors, many of whom either had no sons or no children at all, would select a relative of some sort, sometimes quite distant, sometimes barely related, sometimes not related at all, as to designate as their successor. And one emperor would adopt the next man as his successor. And this led to an unusually high quality in terms of succession, because it wasn't based solely on biology. It was based on finding the best person for the job. And so these emperors are often also referred to as the good emperors, and I always put good in quotation marks when I say that, because insofar as an autocrat can be a good person, these guys were not too bad as a rule. But so we begin our process with the Emperor Trajan. As it turns out, the examination by the conservators at the Torlonia Foundation discovered that this bust of Trajan on the left is completely 19th century. It is not ancient at all, but it is definitely Hadrian. I keep saying Hadrian. We'll get to Hadrian in a minute. Sorry. It is definitely Trajan. And next to him, I have this sculpture, statue of a woman redone as Plotina, who is Trajan's wife. And so again, she looks like a goddess or a priestess. She's holding a patera, which is a cup for libation offerings, but it is Plotina's face. What we discovered with doing the research for this show, thanks to the very important work done by recent historians as well as art historians, is that this old paradigm or description or narrative of this story, where the best man for the job of emperor picks the next best man for the job, and the women are sort of irrelevant, that traditional argument, that traditional narrative, is really not true. And it's very complicated, because it's the women who provide the connecting link, both biologically, very often, and in terms of social and economic prominence. So Trajan and Plotina did not have any children, but Trajan had a sister who's named Marciana, and she had a daughter. She had a daughter named Matidia. And these two busts, now this is where it gets complicated, because when the Torlonias acquired these busts, they decided, based on the hairstyles, which is usually a good giveaway for imperial women, that these represented Marciana and Matidia respectfully. We now know that they don't look like either one of those women. What they are apparently are private Roman women who want to emulate the empresses, or these imperial women. They want to look like them and take on some of their qualities and virtues. And so you will have women, we'll say portrait of a woman formerly known as Marciana, and so the Torlonia desired to have one of each of imperial men and imperial women. Gets interestingly complicated by the fact that these busts in fact depict private women emulating these imperial women. In the Flavian dynasty, which precedes this period and up to the reign of Trajan, hairstyles for women were quite elaborate. They generally all follow the same pattern. Roman women, were supposed to follow the same pattern, a nodus or a kind of bun or chignon in the back of the head, and then you could do whatever you wanted in the front. And these women kept their hair very long. They didn't cut it, and so it could be very elaborately styled. That changed when the Emperor Hadrian succeeded. We finally come to Hadrian. So Hadrian was sort of related, he was a cousin relation to Trajan, but his ties to the imperial family were strengthened, first because the Empress Plotina, wife of Trajan, was very fond of Hadrian and recognized him as an intelligent guy and a capable guy, and they shared an interest in the arts. Plotina was a great patron of poets and philosophers and scholars, and so Hadrian was married off to Trajan's great niece, Sabina. Sabina was the daughter of Matidia, Hadrian's niece, daughter of Marciana. So it's the female line that is connecting here. And again, this is a portrait of a woman formerly thought to be Sabina, but is wearing a Sabina-like hairstyle. And Sabina introduced a relatively simpler kind of hairstyle after those elaborate confections of the Flavian and Trajanic periods. What also complicates these things is, how do you know it's Hadrian? How do you know it's Trajan? These male imperial portraits are much more realistic, or much more, consistently look like, once you see Hadrian's face, you recognize it. That said, it gets even more complicated because over the course of an emperor's reign, and this was sometimes true of the imperial women as well, as we'll see, there will be successive portrait types. It's sort of established when the emperor becomes adopted by the previous emperor, or when you ascend the throne officially, or on the 10th anniversary of your accession to the throne. A new portrait type of you will be developed in Rome and then disseminated throughout the vast Roman Empire, which at the 2nd century was at its height, stretching from Britain to Spain and Portugal to North Africa to well into the Middle East. And so these faces become very recognizable. The Art Institute has a head of Hadrian of this same portrait type. One of the things I had to do for the show, which was very, very, it sounds tedious, but it was really interesting. I had to make a spreadsheet of all these portrait types and determine which fit into what in terms of the Torlonia Collection. Another connecting link between all of these women, between Trajan's women and Sabina, was that these women owned brick factories, which, when you're building an empire, bricks are really, you're building a lot of buildings, bricks are great, and so they were, a lot of the family wealth came into this. Hadrian and Sabina also had no children. In fact, they did not have a very happy marriage, Hadrian being primarily interested in men, so was Trajan, but that didn't seem to disturb his marriage too much. But so another smart man was selected ultimately to be Hadrian's successor. It's a little complicated, but this is where it ends up, with the Emperor Antoninus Pius. On the right is, so this is Antoninus Pius on the left, and on the right is a woman formerly thought to be his wife, Faustina the Elder. And this is, you see this hairstyle with this kind of top knot, and the braids kind of wound around, and this is a coin that we have in the Art Institute dedicated to Faustina the Elder, and it's hard to make out, but she's got a veil which gives her a kind of priestess-like or goddess-like appearance, and this sort of top knot, but this is clearly not Faustina the Elder's face. This is, again, a private aristocratic woman wanting to look like and models herself after the exemplary Empress Faustina the Elder. The successor of Antoninus Pius, he was co-ruler for a little bit with Lucius Verus, who we also have in the exhibition, but ultimately the sole emperor who succeeded Antoninus Pius was Marcus Aurelius, who has become very famous again in recent years. He was a Stoic philosopher, and his so-called Meditations, which are a series of sort of philosophical statements, are still very popular and very widely read. Here are two busts of Marcus Aurelius from the Torlonia Collection, which will be in the exhibition. They're basically portrait types 2 and 3. You have, he starts out as sort of a boy, and then he's a young man, as he is here on the left, and then an older man, and then in type 4, he is, the beard has gotten longer, the expression has gotten sadder, the hair gets bigger. Hadrian started the sort of curly hairstyle and the beard, possibly to look like a Greek philosopher, which is something that would be very important to Marcus Aurelius, who modeled himself after Greek Stoic philosophers. Marcus Aurelius's wife, Faustina the Younger, was the daughter of Antoninus Pius and Faustina the Elder. So once again, we see it's the women who form the connecting link. And this is definitely Faustina the Younger. She has a very distinctive physiognomy when you're used to seeing her. And she's very important too, because she, unlike the previous emperors of this period, she and Marcus Aurelius actually had children together. At least 12, possibly as many as 15. We're not exactly sure. Most of them did not survive childhood or even infancy. But still, in this coin in the Art Institute, and you see this is the Faustina the Younger hairstyle, which then became a sort of a thing for Roman empresses and imperial women going forward for a few decades, this sort of waves of hair with this sort of low bun or chignon on the back. And in this coin in the Art Institute, on the back of it is the goddess Juno, represented in her aspect as Lucina, who is the goddess of childbirth. And so this would be very important for Faustina the Younger, with having all of these children. So Marcus Aurelius was succeeded by his son, the first emperor in this period to be born to the purple, that is, born to become the successor of his father. And so when they switched from adoption to full-on biology, it was a disaster. And Commodus was a psychopath. He was a horrible, horrible individual. Again, there are a couple of portrait types that you see represented here, relatively younger on the left, more mature, in terms of years anyway, on the right. Commodus was eventually assassinated. And it set off a series of dynastic struggles. So we were originally going to end this part of the exhibition with Commodus, and we thought, oh, that's such a downer. So the curators are borrowing these two, which are the man who ultimately, there were about 4 contenders to the imperial throne after the assassination of Commodus, and the man who won is, you see on the left, Septimius Severus, who came from North Africa, came from what is now Libya. And so he was born in North Africa. I forgot to mention the Trajan and Hadrian both came from what is now Spain. Septimius Severus came from North Africa. His wife, Julia Domna, was from Syria originally and was a member of a very prominent dynasty there. And I've mentioned all these elaborate hairstyles. Julia Domna was the first empress that we know of to wear wigs, and this is quite clearly would seem to be a wig. And so this is even though this is not like happily ever after in terms of the Roman Empire, given the fact that their 2 sons hated each other and one ended up killing the other, in his mother's arms, no less. This is Caracalla and Gaeta. If you've seen Gladiator 2, I haven't, but if you've seen it, Caracalla and Gaeta appear, but they're totally wrong historically in terms of personality. And unfortunately, Julia Domna does not appear, which is a real shame because she was an amazing person too, another great patron of learning and the arts. So from there is a section in the exhibition. There are some objects which are connected to funerary sculpture. And this is where things start to get, these sort of composite sculptures that I refer to really show up in interesting ways. This is a beautiful portrait group of a husband and wife from some point in the, well, we say 2nd century. And they're standing there. This would be a typical sort of funerary monument. Husband and wife standing, holding hands, joining their hands together, which looks very much like an ancient Roman marriage ceremony, standing side by side. And as you can see in this detail, he's looking at her with such love in his eyes. In fact, the two heads are of different time periods. The bodies are of another time period. And so it's great that they love each other this much, even though they don't know each other and they're not wearing their own clothes. But this gives you an idea of just how smoothly these composite sculptures could be put together. And again, you don't want to separate them, you don't want to take them apart, even if they're modern bits and bobs within a sculpture. You don't want to remove it because it's become part of the history of the piece. A similar story here with this, if I am correct, this is the heaviest object in the exhibition, and to the extent that we have to show the lid and the sarcophagus, the coffin itself separately, because they can't be, the lid can no longer be on top of this sarcophagus because it's too heavy. It is typical that you have a carved marble sarcophagus. At some point during the 2nd century, the Romans went from cremating their dead to burying them, to exhumation, and we don't know why. But they start doing this, and so these beautifully carved, elaborate sarcophagi in marble start appearing. And this is typical. This one is decorated with the labors of Hercules, because Hercules, these labors of Hercules are taken as symbolic of the struggles of life, which eventually lead to immortality, as Hercules ended up on Mount Olympus and became a full-fledged god. So the sarcophagus is one source, and then there's the lid with the bodies, and again, the heads are of different time periods that are placed onto this particular sculpture. Another sarcophagus in the show, this is a stridulated sarcophagus, as we call it, because of this pattern, this sort of elongated S shape, which looks like a strigil, one of these scrapers that you used, for example, in ancient Rome when you went to the baths and put your scented oil on and wanted to scrape off the excess. You used a strigil with it to do it. We don't know if that's what this is supposed to be or if there's any symbolism to this ornamental motif, but it appears on a number of sarcophagi. And you have these magnificent lions. This is a side view, lions with their tamers. And so this imagery of the arena of lions as strength, of animal fights and humans fighting animals in the arena for entertainment is also very common, perhaps again, connected to the theme of struggle. But then on a more touching note is this beautiful small relief, the funerary monument of a boy. And there is an inscription which has been deciphered and translated, is that it gives his name, it gives his age, which was 14 years old. And this would have been dedicated by his loving parents. We see this over and over again in ancient art. Another common myth is that, in the old days, infant mortality rates were so high that people didn't get attached to their kids because they probably wouldn't live anyway. There's an enormous amount of evidence, both visual and literary, of parents mourning their children as any parent would. And then there is a section of deities, of gods and goddesses and mythological subjects. That we've seen the Hestia Justiniani before, and here she is with a detail. Now, what's interesting too about this sculpture, this is probably it's from the 2nd century, but it is probably a copy after a much earlier sculpture. And we know that partly because the way it's structured with this very heavy drapery that forms a sort of column was probably originally bronze, now lost. But also because of the style. It looks like a particular moment in ancient Greek art in the sort of early 5th century BCE, when you're transitioning from the archaic period to the full-on, what we call the classical period. There is this moment which is referred to as the severe style. And this looks very much like severe style sculpture, the very monumental frontality of the figure, the relative kind of simplicity of the drapery. The drapery folds are not, crazy and inventive. They're sort of solid and clean and again, create this effect like a fluted column. Roman copies of Greek sculptures were extremely common. One way to prove your culture, your sophistication, was to be aware of Greek art and Greek poetry and Greek philosophy. And so copies of Greek sculptures were very common and very popular, but even going back to these pre-classical eras where you would have a much simpler style, archaic, severe, or sort of early classical, and probably was popular because it was an antidote to the more elaborate, ornate, dramatic, Hellenistic and Roman styles of sculpture. I mean, by contrast, this is a sculpture of Aphrodite, the goddess of love and beauty, with Eros and Katos, which is a kind of sea monster, but on the right, but that's sort of a restoration. There was a different kind of creature there originally. But the figure of Aphrodite based ultimately on the Aphrodite of Cnidos by Praxiteles from the mid-4th century BCE, and this, which develops into these Roman Venus types of, she's sort of coyly hiding her, trying to cover her nakedness and kind of leaning, hunching over slightly. But this much more elaborate, twisted kind of figure, the more detail, etc., some of which is later restoration or contribution. But again, it's a real contrast to that kind of solemn dignity of the Hestia. And then also from the sort of Hellenistic tradition, sort of charming groups. The Hellenistic era, this period after Alexander the Great, as Greek civilization spread all over the Mediterranean, and as the Romans kind of wholesale adopt that culture as well as wholesale conquering a lot of these Hellenistic cities, you see a work like this. They loved Hellenistic art, which the Romans pick up on, love sort of very young and very old. They love the extremes and the very beautiful and the very grotesque. And they love to sort of mix these things all together. And this is a statue of Cupid and Psyche from the myth thereof, in which Cupid, who makes people fall in love by shooting them with arrows, accidentally scratches himself with an arrow and falls in love with Psyche, this princess. And basically, you can see that she has wings, these butterfly wings. Psyche is the Greek word for soul. So the myth is taken to be, even in ancient times, this kind of allegory of love and the soul joining together. But it's a very charming group of two childlike figures embracing. Another Aphrodite, or Venus, crouching Aphrodite. This is a very common and very popular type in late Greek art, Hellenistic art, which carries over into the Roman period. She's again trying to sort of hide after she gets out of the bath, being sort of coy. And this is a work that you will be able to see from more than one angle in the exhibition. And what's interesting is she's sort of moving and twisting and turning, but at the same time there's a kind of, at least from the side, there's a kind of block-like structure to her. But you can see in this detail some of the beauty of the carving and the fleshiness of it. we'll have an Athena, the goddess of wisdom, war, and handicrafts. As here, again, this has the feel of it's just sometime between the late 1st century BCE and the 2nd century CE. It can be very difficult to precisely date a lot of these copies or variants or works done in an earlier style, because you will have sculptures which are probably original and not copies of Greek works, but you have these sculptors of this Roman era doing sculptures that are deliberately done in these older styles, archaic, severe, classical, late classical, and this is a case in point. She has again, a kind of classical dignity and nobility, and also has in her left hand a little owl, which is her symbol, which is apparently a later restoration, but he's very cute. Which is why we think owls are wise, because they're associated with Athena, even though I'm not sure how wise owls actually are, but this is the stereotype because of this association with her. Other representations of children, and again, these restorations can get extremely complicated. On the right, we have the infant Bacchus, the god of wine and revelry, related to or taking on some of the attributes of the Greek god Dionysus. He is associated with goats and other wild animals. On the left is a statue of a boy, but restored as Harpocrates. Harpocrates was it's hard to describe. He was a deity who the Greeks kind of, I won't say the Greeks invented him, that's not correct. But when Greeks started looking at Egyptian sculptures or paintings or representations of the child god Horus, of one of the most potent and important of the Egyptian gods, and they saw this little child with his finger at its mouth, they assumed they came up with this, the Ptolemaic Hellenistic rulers and others came up with this image of a god, Harpocrates, the god of silence. That he's saying, shh. But in fact, what the Greeks didn't realize is that in ancient Egyptian art, when you see a little figure with its finger in its mouth, that's just the Egyptian way of indicating that this is a child. This is the convention for a child is sucking on its finger, like sucking your thumb. But they took this to mean, the god of silence, and it shows you how mystical the Egyptians are. This is what they came up with. And so you find a lot of these Greco-Roman representations of this deity, Harpocrates, with a little kind of Egyptian-y headdress, as well as a cornucopia, a horn of plenty. Sometimes these restorations can get that where they don't, they weren't quite sure of what, the restorers weren't sure of what the original actually looked like. For example, there is a type called the Chasey Silenus. The Chasey family owned a particular version of this sculpture, and the Torlonia Collection has a Silenus of this type. Silenus was part of the entourage of Dionysus. He is usually represented as a sort of drunken, fleshy, old satyr who is just drunk, and in this case carrying a wineskin, which is how you transported wine in antiquity in the ancient Mediterranean, this animal skin, which kind of sucks in and leaves out all the oxygen so that the wine doesn't spoil. Box wines work in a very similar way, apparently. The sort of plastic, though, takes all the oxygen out. But the one on the right, which is from a private collection, which is currently on loan to the Art Institute of Chicago, has restored the figure as not as a Silenus, but as a much cuter young satyr. And satyrs don't necessarily have to have goat legs. They can have little goat tails or little goat horns or something, or pointy ears or something like that. But this is the case here. And this is an example where we're going to have this Torlonia Silenus and our satyr with wineskin side by side in our gallery, so you can make a comparison. Some of the deities represented in this collection and in this exhibition will be foreign deities. And so, for example, two sculptures, one on the left, which is Isis restored as Ceres, the Roman goddess of agriculture, and on the right is Isis, or a woman who is part of the cult of Isis. Isis, of course, the great revered goddess among the Egyptians. And Isis, in the Roman imperial period, Isis was worshipped all over the Mediterranean and was very popular in the Roman Empire. There was a temple of Isis at Pompeii, for instance. And we know it's Isis because of she's got sort of headdress, and she's holding a sistrum, which is like a rattle that was used in Egyptian rituals to get the attention of the gods, make that rattling sound. Both of these sculptures employ sometimes ancient, sometimes modern parts in white marble, used with bodies of a marble type which Italians call biggio, which is this kind of beautiful bluish gray. And then there will be this quite large sculpture, which represents is a personification of the river Nile. The Romans imagined river gods as being basically old men lying down. And so here you have an example. He's got what makes him the Nile? Well, he's got the Horn of Plenty, which associates with the fertility of the Nile Valley. Egypt was the breadbasket of the Roman Empire, and its grain fed the empire. But you've got a sphinx on one side, which indicates Egypt, and then on the left, a crocodile. So it's supposed to be the Nile. And then there is this sculpture of the great mother goddess from Asia Minor, who is somewhat confusingly called the Artemis of Ephesus. Artemis, the Greek goddess, was the goddess of the hunt, and she was actually not a mother goddess, but a sort of militant virgin goddess. But she was Artemis, the Greek Artemis was also, as goddess of the hunt, was mistress of wild beasts. And so this mother goddess, also called Artemis in the East, is also commands nature and commands the animals. And there are representations of animals all over her. This is a very typical way of representing her. And again, using this sort of dark marble for the face and hands, and then white marble elsewhere. And then she has these appendages, you can see on the lower torso, which have been identified variously as breasts, sometimes as fruits, sometimes as the testicles of sacrificed bulls. All of these things mean fertility. This is a goddess of fertility. And all of these deities from all these different parts of the empire are starting to come into Rome and being worshipped. And some Roman authorities could get a little nervous, especially when there were rumors of certain rituals getting out of hand in various ways. But you have to understand that we say pagan, but of course pagan just meant just everything that was going on, and there were deities of all kinds. Some of them traveled to other places, some it was a little harder to do. And then in terms of the issue of these kind of copies and multiples, on the right you see a work which is, again, from a private collection currently on loan to the Art Institute, and then two versions from the Torlonia Collection, which will be in the exhibition. And this is the same subject, Leda and the Swan. This is a Greek mythological subject in which Zeus, the chief god, as he often did, is lusting after somebody, and so he transforms himself into something in order to seduce this person while also evading the jealous gaze of his wife Hera, the goddess of marriage. And so in order to seduce Leda, the queen of Sparta, he turned himself into a swan. And this sculptural type, there are a number of surviving examples from antiquity. A theory is, which is difficult to prove, if not impossible to prove, is that this is a copy after a lost original by a Greek sculptor of the 4th century BCE named Timotheus. But we don't really know if that's definitely the case. But in each case, she is lifting up her veil because Zeus's eagle is trying to attack the swan, and the swan is sort of curled up, its long neck sort of curled up between her breasts in this very sensual way, and she's holding up her veil to try to protect it. And in these sculptures, you can see this beautiful handling of the hand with the veil held up and the way the fingers appear through it. The one in the middle, I should add, again, one of the Torlonia examples, it's really fascinating because the Torlonia Foundation has deliberetely refrained from cleaning all of the sculpture. So those brown areas you see are the dirty parts that they don't want to clean so that people can see what's before and after, basically, what something looks like with age and time and how it looks like when you use your solvents and clean. And we want to make comparisons just as we do with the Chasey Silenus and our young satyr to make a comparison between multiples of the same thing. I realize I'm going over time, but I have just a few more to do if you'll just bear with me. The only out-and-out Greek work in the exhibition, which will be this relief, which is from Athens and dates from the height of the classical period, the late 5th century BCE. A scene, probably a sacrificial scene or a ritualistic scene, but it was excavated in Rome near the sort of supposedly on the Appian Way near the tomb of Cecilia Metella. And it was probably brought over in the 2nd century from Athens to Rome. Again, this reverence for classical antiquity, what for Romans was classical antiquity, from the height of Athenian culture up until the 2nd century CE is 700 years. So it was a gap for them. And Hadrian and others really bring back and again intensify this devotion to anything classical and Greek. And so that this relief was brought over at this time. But something that is very much of its moment, but also is not, related to an interesting story in history. This from the Torlonia Collection, an unfinished sculpture, so you can see what something looks like when they abandon work on it for reasons that are not clear, of a Dacian prisoner. Trajan fought wars and conquered Dacia, which is, well, now what was Dacia is now, so it's in sort of Romania and Croatia. There's a whole bunch of states around there in the Balkans where it took place. And he comes from that part of the world. He has this kind of cap. And he's also, it's hard to see, but he's wearing pants. If you're looking at Greek and Roman art and somebody's wearing pants, you know they're a barbarian. They're not toga-wearing people. They wear these kinds of trousers. Trajan had a monumental arch erected to celebrate, or the Senate voted for him to have an arch to celebrate his victory over the Dacians, which included sculptures of these Dacian prisoners with their hands bound. Those sculptures of Dacian prisoners were then recycled in the early 4th century and placed on the arch of the Emperor Constantine, recycling being very common in ancient Roman sculpture, and especially by the time you get to the 3rd and early 4th centuries, when they're just taking bits and pieces and incorporating them. And so we don't know why the Torlonia example never made it to the monument, or we don't know what happened, but it's part of the collection and it will be on view. And then there is this amazing sculpture, which was excavated at the Porto, or Portus in ancient times, very near Ostia, the port of Rome. And it's an incredibly elaborate kind of image which incorporates versions of actual sculptures which were at the city of Portus with idealized figures of deities who are protecting it. There is a ship coming in. There is, you might be able to see sort of just off to the right there, lower part, there's a large human eye, which may be carved later, but has, this is to ward off the evil eye. And the whole thing seems to be about having a prosperous voyage and a safe landing home. And on board the ship are figures who kind of look like the Emperor Septimius Severus and Empress Julia Domna, but we can't be sure. And then it's down below, there's a figure who appears to be of African ethnicity who is helping to guide the ship. It's a fascinating, fascinating piece. And this is a piece that has, when you look at it in person, which I got to do for the first time the other day, it was very exciting. There are little traces of red paint in some of the little nooks and crannies of it, so you can see how things were originally, get a little glimpse of how things were originally painted. And then, as I mentioned, there is one bronze in the Torlonia collection, and we're getting it, this idealized, beautiful nude youth who probably represents Germanicus, the step-grandson of the Emperor Augustus, which is why I said there's actually more than one Augustan figure in the show. But we have examples like this, of this kind of ideal, beautiful male nude, which is deliberately meant to recall Greek art. The Romans were a little, had their, a little ambivalent about Greek nudity. On the one hand, there was the great admiration for it as the representation of the ideal form. On the other hand, there was the kind of native Roman prudishness, because the Romans were, in fact, by and large, a very prudish people, and so they had these issues with it. But what's interesting about this bronze is why he has this big column thing stuck to his, his right leg. Those kinds of supports are not necessary in bronze sculptures, even if the figure is twisting and turning, because the sculptures are hollow and the weight balances. You need that for a marble sculpture in order to hold it up while it's doing a pose. So is this a bronze after a marble, or was it more likely that some later restorer got confused and thought, oh, well, it's a sculpture of a nude guy, you got to stick a column next to him because that's what they did, and so added a bronze column to fill it out. And then two more sculptors, just two more works. A ram with a figure of Odysseus beneath it. Now this is, if you know Homer's Odyssey, you know this is the section where Odysseus and his men are being held prisoner by Polyphemus, the one-eyed giant, who they blind him and poke out his one eye, and then tie themselves to the bottom of his sheep. And so Polyphemus feels the sheep leaving and thinks it's just the sheep leaving, and that's how the men escape. And we're putting it next to a sculpture of a ram that we have on loan from a private collector, so you can make that comparison. And then concluding with this sculpture of a goat, which is 1st century, but the head is attributed to Gian Lorenzo Bernini, the great sculptor of 17th century Rome, whose fingerprint is all over Rome in terms of sculpture and architecture ever since the 17th century. And it shows you, as I mentioned, prominent sculptors got to work on this kind of restoration work. This was not considered beneath them to do this. And once again, you want to take the head off? Sure, but then you're taking the Bernini section off, so why would you want to do that? So that gives you a sense of most of the works in the collection, and I want to point out we're having some very exciting programs to go with it, and there's at least one more which we're waiting for details of, so I didn't put it on the screen yet. There will be member preview days for the exhibition on March 13th and 14th, preview lectures given by the co-curators, Lisa Chakmok on the 13th, Catherine Raff on the 14th. Exhibition opens to the public on March 15th. Oh God, I put March 17th. Oops, it's May 17th, silly me. at 1 p.m. a program called Eternal City Art and Music in Rome, which I'll be participating in along with Stephen Altop, who will be playing harpsichord, and his beautiful wife, Josephine Stoplenberg, who will be singing soprano. And then we will have a mythology program. Again, we're waiting to determine the title of that show, of that program, on June 5th. So we will have using the Torlonia Collection as a springboard to discuss mythology both in the exhibition and in the Art Institute collections. So thank you very much for your patience while I went through all of this. Thank you again for having me speak. Thank you. Thank you. And please do come and see the exhibition.
I have a question about, do you know how they trained the artisans to do this? Were they in part of a wealthy home, or did they have workshops?
Well, the sculptors themselves in ancient times, there were workshops, and they were quite large ones. And it was not a cottage industry. I mean, they were sort of, you would need a team of people, certainly for bronze sculpture, which is an extremely elaborate process, but also for marble sculpture. And so you could both commission things and also buy off the shelf. And so it was common to do both, depending on what you needed. For imperial portraiture, usually the portraits were, we're not dealing in this exhibition with provincial styles of portraiture or even of art which is a fascinating subject, but since most everything was excavated in Rome or near it, we're figuring it was all done near the capital. But for example, often with imperial portraits, they might be done in Rome and then shipped out to the provinces and attached to bodies that were there, so you wouldn't have to be shipping all that marble all over the place. But there were workshops all over the Roman Empire, and a lot of the sculptors were Greeks. Because sculpture making, marble carving were considered to be things that Greeks did very well. And so the names of sculptors we have from the Roman period are largely Greek names. So yeah, these were quite large operations.
How did all these sculptures come out of the ground in the backyard? I mean, is that where they were found?
Well, that's where, in the cases where we know where things were found, like, for example, some of these earlier collections like Giustiniani, Albani, we're not always sure where they came from, where they were dug up. With the Torlonia collection, with those excavations, we know in many instances, or at least we go by what Carlo Ludovico Visconti says in his catalog of where they came from. And on these Torlonia properties, they came up, they were probably dirty, and they were probably with pieces missing, or, then things would have to be restored. The cleaning has only really been a big thing in recent years. And so, but I would imagine a lot of these came up in a pretty sad, dirty state, and they did their best with them, but they, as I said, the Torlonias just funded people to go out and start digging on the estates, and if they hit something and dug something up, it was great. But especially it was a lot during the 1850s, 60s, 70s when they were doing these and pulling these things up out of the ground. So
it's amazing. And
yeah,
some of these are very big. I mean,
yeah, they're huge. Some of them are huge. I mean, the Nile sculpture is like 6 feet wide and about 4.5 feet tall. Some of them are quite large. Most of the portrait busts are like 3.5 feet tall. That includes the head, the bust, and the socle, or the little base that it stands on. So they can vary. Some of them are quite sort of on the smaller side and sort of cute, but they're pretty substantive.
I want to thank you for bringing in the pants things. That was something new, but it fits.
Yeah.
That it was only barbarians that wore pants.
Yeah. How often does an exhibit like this put together? Well, in this particular case, our department, Greek, Roman, and Byzantine, has not had an exhibition of this scale ever before. We've had some loan pieces before. We had a few objects from the British Museum when we opened the Jaharis Galleries in 2012. But this is nothing, a scale like nothing that our department has ever worked with before. These Torlonia sculptures, again, were in storage. People knew they existed, but people weren't able to see them for a very long time. And then they started taking them out in the late 2010s and starting to clean them. And the Art Institute was going to, there was a show that went to Milan and as well as Rome. And the Art Institute was going to be the U.S. venue of that in 2020. So we know what happened. And then the Milan-Rome show took place in 2021. And so when Lisa Chakmak came from the St. Louis Art Museum and joined the Art Institute in July of 2021, she started the idea up again and was able to work this out with the foundation. There were some Torlonia sculptures, including some crossover with ours, but not exactly the same, at the Louvre for a few months last year into this year. But this is the first time these things will be on view in the U.S., in Chicago, and then after leaving Chicago, the show goes to the Kimball Museum in Fort Worth, and then to Montreal. So this will be, again, these are so this is huge for us, for our department. It's been a huge undertaking, but it's totally worth it because we're very, very excited about it. Yes.
I found it very interesting, the part about putting the hair on the statue. Mm-hmm. And I was wondering if there are other details on any of the sculptures or statues that are added on rather than sculpted in, and what material did they use, did they have a glue or whatever when they're adding things on?
Right, well, the Romans did that themselves too. I mean, not just later periods, but the Romans generally used cement, which was kind of a Roman invention, in order to glue things together and you smooth them out. I'm not sure what they have often used in later time periods, but I mean, a lot of these sculptures have added, bits. Like I said, with the funerary couple have two different heads and different bodies, and everything's ancient. It's just it didn't originally belong together. But this is not unusual for Roman. We have, for example, a head of a woman in our Roman art collection, which is a marble head, and she has a diadem or tiara, and she has some waves of hair in the front. And then the back of her head is this rough hewn, and at first we thought, oh, maybe she was up against a wall or in a niche, and you were supposed to see the back. But it's more likely that it was to be able to, change hairstyle as needed. And the Romans did this a lot with, as one emperor succeeded another, as one empress succeeded another, who wants to carve an entirely new body? You just replace the heads. And for example, the story is that when the Emperor Nero divorced his wife Octavia and married his mistress Poppaea Sabina, he ordered all the heads of Octavia to be removed from all the statues in Rome and replaced with heads of Poppaea. The Roman populace, who hated Poppaea because they loved Octavia, took all the heads of Poppaea off and put heads of Sabina back on, of Octavia back on. And you wonder, how did they do that? Well, that's how they did it. Their heads are interchangeable. If you see if you go to the Art Institute, you see we have a sculpture that looks like a goddess from the Parthenon, and in fact, it's Roman. It was probably a deified empress, an empress who had been created a goddess. And the head is missing, but it's not just broken off. There's this well where it was, and that's clearly you stick a different head on. And it was very, very common. As I said, they recycled a lot throughout Roman history, but a little more so during the 3rd and early 4th centuries when the political and economic situation was much more precarious.
Thank you very much for such an informative lecture.
Thank you.